Smart Sound. Smart Sound.
Introduce tonight's speaker. Neil Lynch is the chairman of the Minnesota chapter of the Republican Liberty Caucus. I'd love to tell you what that means, but I'm going to let him do that. It's a nationwide organization dedicated to advancing the principles of liberty within the Republican Party. And I think that's important to repeat that, within the Republican Party. They do that through education, advocacy, and winning elections. Aside from his current role, Neil has served as vice chair for both Senate District 34, the 3rd Congressional District. Neil was the delegate to the Republican National Convention in 2012. He has worked on political campaigns for state, Senate, and U.S. Senate races. Neil is a native of Southern California, although by looking at him, a little pasty, and is the father of 3 young adults. With that, please welcome Neil Lynch.
Thanks. Give me a second here to do some adjusting. If I look a little stiff, it's because I had surgery to remove a herniated disc in my neck 3 weeks ago. So this scar on my neck is not from a knife fight, just so you know. I think this clicker works. So a little bit about the Republican Liberty Caucus. We've talked about it. It's a nationwide organization. The chapter here was started in 2003. The organization started nationally in 1991. It is the oldest liberty-minded organization working within the Republican Party that exists. And if people, I get the question a lot, why do we need that? Because isn't that what the Republican Party is about? Right. Have you been watching lately? Yeah. So our job is to work within the party to affect change. And we're not just rabble-rousers and bomb throwers. We try to actually build relationships with legislators. We try to work within the system. We try to get delegates to come out to caucus and to be at conventions. And we also work actively on campaigns. We've spent money, against Democratic candidates in elections. So it's a great organization. The website, I neglected to put a thing up here just because I don't want the focus. It's rlcminnesota.org is the organization. If you want to find out more, you can go there, rlcminnesota.org. We just had a state convention recently and elected a new, fantastic board of directors. A lot of people who are very active in the Republican Party in general who want to see change. So tonight's presentation, I'm going to set the stage for you. It will be controversial, and that's by design. It might be emotional, but I want to share with you my personal journey with how I came to this conclusion that I will present, obviously, at the very end of this. Okay? I'll give you a little background on myself, a little background on the thought process that led me to where I am, and I think that my goal for this is I want this audience to just think about these things. I don't expect to convince you of anything. I don't expect to turn you today, maybe tomorrow. No, but seriously, I expect you to just hear what's being said and think about it. And I know that there will be different opinions on things, and that's fine. But again, I think this is a good way, a good discussion point. Oh, and one other thing too, by the way, I'm a huge fan of the fair tax. I was telling him earlier. I got involved with that back in 2010 for a little bit, which meant I read a lot of books on the fair tax. So, my presentation is liberty, and I say it's the key to religious freedom. So, of course, if we're going to start talking about terminology, we need to define what we're talking about, okay? For the purpose of this discussion, liberty from a dictionary definition is the freedom from arbitrary or despotic government control. I think we can all agree with that. A definition that I like to use when I describe liberty in the context of politics is the freedom to live and act how one chooses, so long as that freedom does not infringe on the rights of others, which is a very important distinction to make. Some people refer to this as being libertarian. I will talk about that term later, but I'm just throwing it out there to set the stage. Again, flowing into my personal background. So we've defined liberty for the purpose of this discussion, and then we'll define religious freedom, which is really easy. It's the First Amendment of the Constitution, right? Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the fair exercise thereof. Obviously, we all know there are huge problems with this. We know that everybody's focused on the first half, and nobody seems to focus on the second half of that. Everybody's all about making no law respecting, but no one's about, everybody wants to prohibit the free exercise. So, for the purpose of this discussion, that's what religious freedom is. Now, a little bit about my personal journey, besides the fact that I'm born in Southern California. Don't hold that against me, please. When I lived there, by the way, I was accused of being from Iowa, because I don't tan. I am Irish. God blessed me with Irish genes, and that means I have freckles and not tan. So, I grew up, believe it or not, in Southern California as a fundamental Baptist. I was a King James and Kulaks person. The sword of the Lord and of Gideon, right? I could, I read the King James Bible, and I was going to be a preacher boy. So I have grown up, and my family at the time grew up in this system for many years. So I was that person. I wasn't quite Westboro Baptist, but I was a step down from that. Okay? And you think I'm joking, but I'm serious. I was the person who had the Bible wrapped in the flag, wrapped in the Constitution, ready to, do whatever in Jesus' name. Now, I'm still a follower of Christ these days, obviously, but the fact is, this, as you all know, is a very specific type of a branch of Christian tradition. So I grew up just like as you would expect that to be. My mother, who wasn't this way, was a Reagan Democrat. She was a card-carrying Democrat until 1980 when Ronald Reagan became president. Now, I don't know if it was because she was a movie buff and loved all of his movies or whether she actually liked it, but she became a Republican from that moment forward till the day she died because of Ronald Reagan. So whenever they talk about Reagan Democrats, my mom was one of them. And my father was politically involved too, but his was more about making bumper stickers that offended people than it was about actually doing anything. So, and I can tell you stories about that. So, as I was moving away from my fundamental Baptist roots, and as our country began to change in 2008 after President Obama was elected, I just became furious about the abridgment of our rights, what this guy was doing. You name it, whatever you were mad about then, I was mad about too. And then when Obamacare was passed, I lost it. So, I did the only thing that a sane, rational person would do in that case. Oh, hang on. I beat myself on a point. At the time, the Tea Party movement was just getting started. Rick Santel did his thing on CNBC and everybody got excited. So I was passionate. I was emboldened by that, seeing the travesty happening at our federal government, seeing what the Tea Party was doing, and I was emboldened. And then, okay, so now here's my point. I did the only rational, sane thing that you would do. I decided to run for public office. Oh no, not just any public office. This is the Federal Elections Commission website. You want to see really close there? I ran for the U.S. House against Eric Paulson in 3rd Congressional District as an independent for 72 days. Now, I had no political experience before this. I literally researched everything online to how to run for Congress. It was just the funniest thing. This whole process, I managed to insert myself directly into Minnesota politics. I had no idea there was a caucus system when I did this. I had no idea how Minnesota politics worked. I'm from California. They don't have caucuses. What's that? Caucus, is that the thing you put on the tub to keep things from leaking? I don't know what it is, but so I did this. Anyway, I managed to jump in and get involved. And what happened was, as I was building my campaign website for my 72-day campaign, I began to look, I had to do a position page, like, okay, what are my positions on various issues? And as I began to research and really search my heart, I realized something. I'm a libertarian. But what does that mean? Well, again, for the purpose of our discussion today, it's a political philosophy that upholds liberty as its principal objective. So the things I referred to earlier, it holds those. Now, it also, and this is a part of, when you talk about libertarian, this is what I mean by this. Maximizing autonomy and freedom of choice, emphasizing these three big things. And we're going to talk about those. Political freedom, voluntary association, and the primacy of individual judgment. So the individual being prime. Okay? So that's my journey. That's how I came to this point. And again, as you can imagine, growing up as a fundamental Baptist and having a lot of that tradition still with me, there were a few issues that I had to reconcile if I was going to claim to be full libertarian, or at least identify myself as libertarian. And I won't talk about all the issues. But there's one particular issue that gave me pause, and I said, I don't know if I can overcome this. Gay marriage. I said, I have no point of reference here. I've been taught one thing all of my life. I don't know how can I get around this. Because I knew what a lot of libertarians and what the liberty position was on this position. So I thought, okay, how am I going to reconcile this? This is very difficult. So for the next few minutes, what I'd like to do is walk you through my journey of how I came to this conclusion, and then apply those points across a broader scale. I only use this, by the way, as one example. You can take this and apply it to anything. So the first thing is thinking about the institution of marriage. Obviously, I think all of us in here would agree that it is a religious institution, and in many cases, a civil institution. Marriages were done for political reasons, for alliances, for convenience. They were all arranged, but it is a religious institution. Obviously, the Bible talks about marriage. I mean, it is prime in the Bible. So, I know all this stuff. And also, not just the Bible, but you talk about Judaism and even other religious traditions. Marriage is tantamount. It's important. It's incredibly important. So, it's existed for as long as history's existed, the notion of marriage, right? Well, that was loud. So, this whole idea of a group sanctioning marriage and saying that you had to be married a certain way, based on my research, and I'm certainly open to things, the first evidence I could find is that back in 1215, the Catholic Church began to set standards for what constituted a valid marriage within the church. Because before then, two people could just say they were married, and the church would recognize that, or the religious body would recognize that. The Catholic Church began the notion, I forget the exact name of it, but you had to have a ceremony, you had to give 3 Sundays notice, and you had to give time for people to object in case one of them was already married to somebody else or that kind of thing. So again, like in today's marriage ceremony where they say if anybody has any reason, that's where it started. Okay? So this is the first recorded notion that we have, and there may be others. This is the first recorded time where an outside body had to approve of marriage. So, funny enough, fast forward to the Massachusetts colony in the 1600s. There were a group of dissenters who didn't like how the Church of England did things when it came to marriage. So in 1639, the state of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts actually began requiring marriage licenses. So this is the point, as far as I can tell from my research, where government became involved in marriage. And ironically, it was because they didn't like what the church was doing. So when you start thinking about what's happened since then, and here's a principle that I will lay out for you here. License or permit is permission. Whenever, if you're going to pull a permit to add an addition to your home, you're asking the government permission to do that. A driver's license is a permission to drive on the roads. A marriage license is a permission to get married, right? So now the government gives permission. So now, of course, the government can control what that process is. Now, of course, the first time this became an issue wasn't same-sex marriage. It was interracial marriage. I know that some of you probably remember these days, and it wasn't even 50 years ago that interracial marriage was illegal. In 1967, the Supreme Court basically said that all interracial marriage, the laws banning interracial marriage were unconstitutional. So the government could decide who could get married. So now, fast forward a little bit. In 1979, around the time that my mother got politically involved, Reverend Jerry Falwell, whom, of course, as you would expect, I know very well from my background in history with the Fundamental Baptist Movement, he began a Christian coalition. And that represented the rise of Christians within the Republican Party. Now, obviously, it had always been involved before, but I think that you look historically at the party, and I've talked to some people here in the state of Minnesota who acknowledge the same thing, is that around the 80s is when Christians, and I wouldn't even say just Christians, I would say evangelical Christians, fundamental Christians, they began to become more prominent. They started to take over party leadership positions. They began to exert influence. They began to be more involved. And as a result of that, over time, they began to assert themselves on the question of marriage. They began to push for laws being passed that define marriage as between one man and one woman. All right? So here's a little history about same-sex marriage in the state of Minnesota. And most of this is recent, and you know this because you probably went through it, but in 1997, our legislature actually passed a ban on same-sex marriage that was consistent with the Defense of Marriage Act, which was a federal law passed by President Clinton, a Democrat. Basically, the law said that states didn't have to acknowledge same-sex marriages from other states. So Minnesota just conformed with federal law at that point. And nothing really took place about that until 2010, when there was a strong movement by various groups to introduce and I use the term quotes, but to introduce an amendment to our Constitution to define marriage as being between one man and one woman. And that failed 51 to 47. Ironically, that amendment won every part of the state except Twin Cities and St. Louis County up in the Iron Range. And a few other places, by the way. If you go on Wikipedia, there's an electoral map that shows the different colors. You'd be really surprised at some of the outlying districts where it didn't pass. Anyway, because of the concentration of voters in the cities area, that certainly, that was the case. Now, with that notion, 2 years later, after the traditional marriage group fought to have this codified into law, the gay rights movement fought back. And in 2012, as we all know, they had legislation passed, basically, and it was signed into law. So what happened here is we had two different groups representing two different value systems trying to use government to force the other to do what they wanted. And so the challenge here, and this is something I want to make very clear, and I want to focus this a little bit and let this sink in. By the way, you have not heard me at any point say that I like gay marriage. Okay, you've not heard me say that. That's not the point. When you ask government to control the moral behavior of others, the government then becomes the group that decides morality. And on top of that, that same government is going to be eventually used to control you. So, what's happened is that competing groups have tried to use government to control the other. And it has resulted in, I can't even imagine, trillions of dollars spent on lobbying, on legislation, on just time spent, emotions. I mean, just massive amounts of effort spent by people trying to use government to force others to behave the way they think they should. Okay, so here's what's happened now. the problem with this is now the pendulum has swung completely the other way. Whereas before it was traditional marriage proponents who were pushing this. Now, because of all of the effort put into this, gay marriage has now become a civil rights issue, which, by the way, was their plan all along, because that was how they're going to circumvent the religious liberty aspect of it. Now Christians are being forced to accept gay marriage. You know the story about Jack Phillips, right? The Masterpiece Bakery in Lakewood, Colorado. 2 years ago, after gay marriage was approved or same-sex marriage was passed in Colorado, a gay couple came to his bakery and said, "We want you to bake us a cake." And he said, consistent with his with other encounters he's had, he said, "I can't do it. It's getting my religious convictions. I won't do it." He wasn't mean to him. He was respectful. He was exercising his right of free association and also the right to refuse service to anyone. Well, that wasn't good enough. That gay couple went to the Civil Rights Commission, and in effect, he wasn't charged with anything, but he was basically, He was found to be in contempt of the law. So think about that for a second. He didn't want to serve, it's like he's being forced to bake a cake for somebody. He's being forced to provide a good and service to somebody that he doesn't want to, against his religious convictions. Like, what? Did anybody not see the problem with this going in? And then, of course, it's not just there. A florist in Washington has been charged with violating the civil rights of a gay couple who wanted to use them. A pizza shop owner in Indiana was berated. They had to close their pizza shop because they supported a law, they call it the religious objection law, the conscientious objection law, that basically said that they could not serve people they didn't want to for religious reasons. A photographer in New Mexico has been, not indicted, but has been found in violation of these, and 2 bakers in Oregon, very similar to the Lakewood, Colorado. By the way, as far as I can tell, this case on the top is pending still, and he's still in business, thank God. All right. So if you're in Colorado, I'd go, buy a cake just to support him. So this is the problem now. The problem is the laws that were used to promote one system of belief then became used to promote the other system, and now they're being forced to do this. Now they're being forced to comply, and that's not right either. So both sides, in my opinion, have it wrong, because they both tried to use the force of government to make the other side do what they want them to do. My question is this: why is government involved at all on either side? Now, this isn't just about this issue. We have, as you know very well from our legislative process, we have a long history of government getting involved in our personal lives and taking away our liberties, slowly but surely, either through regulation or through taxation. So this isn't something new here. This has been going on for a long time. This is just a very obvious, open, and controversial example of how that's happened. So people have been using government to control others' behavior. They pass laws. And, oh, by the way, the Democrats do that all the time. We don't like the way you do something. Well, there should be a law against that. You've heard that before, right? I mean, Democrats are famous for this. But unfortunately, both sides are famous for this. They want to use government to control your behavior. It depends in different ways, which is hilarious because Democrats get credit for being friendly to groups like this, right? They're friendly to same-sex couples, yet they want to control how you spend your money, and they want to control where you buy things and what you do, so it's ridiculous. And I'll talk about that in a second. So, but the challenge here is that when we talk about legislating morality, when we talk about using government to make people behave a certain way, it's not just marriage where this happens, okay? Common Core, anybody? Good grief. And when I was married, my wife and I homeschooled our 3 children. My oldest, who's 20 now, was homeschooled all the way through. And I can tell you that the government is very interested in how you educate your children, right? Because the government is so big and is so involved in everything, it is going to violate your rights at some point. It just is. And every time government tries to make things better or do things on your behalf, it is going to cross that line. Obviously, with healthcare, we all know about the Hobby Lobby example where they were, they were being forced by the federal health law to carry contraception when they didn't want to because it violated their religious rights. The tax code is a famous violator. You know, the tax code is used to control and encourage behavior. So if they want you to do something, they'll give you a tax break. If they don't want you to do something, they're going to tax it or regulate it in some way. I think a lot of these problems, and by the way, this is where a lot of the gay marriage issue comes in. I'll go on a little tangent here. I actually spoke with a gentleman who's gay. He and his partner, they didn't want gay marriage because they were going to, are there any kids here? Good. They didn't want to run around and assless chaps down Hollywood Boulevard and say, yeah, we're gay, we're woke. They didn't care about that. They just wanted the benefits. They wanted the benefits from the tax code. They wanted the medical benefits. They wanted the insurance benefits. Okay? So a lot of the problem is because of how the system is designed, because of how things are done, because government is so pervasive in every part of our life that they just wanted a piece of the pie. You know, and I apologize if this is slightly irreverent, but part of me says, oh, you want to get married and have all the joys of marriage? Go for it, be my guest. But that's the problem with government, is that it encroaches on everything. And really, this is one of my big points here. Regardless of how you feel about that particular issue, I think this applies across the board. If you want to protect religious liberty or religious freedom, if you really want to do that, then the principle of liberty says reduce the size and scope of government in our lives at every level. Because the less the government is involved, the less opportunity they have to violate your rights, and the less opportunity somebody can come along and use the government to force you to behave a way you don't want to, that you don't want to. So you think to yourself, okay, that's all great and theoretical, Neil, but we live in reality here. How would you possibly do anything about this? Well, there are 2 examples. They're not perfect examples, as I've read the legislation, but one potential way of doing this is get rid of marriage licenses. Don't let the government be in charge of marriage anymore. Take marriage out of the government's hands. The state of Oklahoma and the state of Alabama have both introduced legislation that would effectively do that. Now, that's a very interesting and creative idea. I don't know how those bills have gone. I don't think they've passed. I know that they were both, Oklahoma was introduced in the House and Alabama was introduced in the Senate. But this is an example. It's reducing the size and scope of government and taking the issue out of the hands of the bureaucrats and letting people decide for themselves how they want to live their life and how they want to conduct their life. Now, that's very consistent here, and I'll remind you of the famous quote from Thomas Jefferson that you've all seen, I'm sure, at a Tea Party meeting once or twice this year. All right? But there's another quote that I like just as much. It's by the Christian author C.S. Lewis, who's the author of the Chronicles of Narnia and the Screwtape Letters. He said this once, which I thought was fantastic. I believe in God, but detest theocracy, for every government consists of mere men and is strictly viewed a makeshift. If it adds to its commands, thus saith the Lord, it lies and lies dangerously. In other words, if you're a Christian, you want God on the throne someday. You do, but he's not there yet. Until then, it's men. And you want those men to have as little power as possible over your life. Because if they have it, they're going to abuse it. And they're going to claim to do it sometimes in the name of God. So, these are my key takeaways. And I've gone through this presentation a little quickly because we have a smaller audience and you've all been paying very good attention, and I appreciate that. Here are my key takeaways. First one is this, is the real issue is not the gay rights movement. Though they're an issue, believe me, because of what they're trying to do, I get that. But really, the issue is the overreach, right, and the out-of-control government. The government has become so powerful, all you have to do is pay a bunch of lobbyists to go up to the Capitol, grease a couple of skids, promise some campaign contributions, and poof, the votes go your way. That's too much power centralized in one place, and that's what we talk about here. That's the real issue, because if the gay rights movement couldn't go in and force things down people's throats or cause them to act in ways that violates the Constitution, that problem wouldn't happen. And that applies across the board to anything, not even religious liberty. The second thing is this, and this is one that I had to really accept. It took a while for me to understand this. If you want liberty, you have to give liberty to others. Listen, there are a lot of things that are legal that I don't think should be legal. Taylor Swift songs, for example. No. But in all seriousness, there are behaviors I don't like. But again, following the principles of liberty, if their behavior and their actions don't violate my rights or the rights of others, who am I to say that they shouldn't do it? Who am I as a government official to tell them you can't do this? And so, if we're going to have an attitude of liberty, then we have to be willing to let others live the way they want, even if it's against our principles and against, in some cases, our morals. Now again, the key is as long as it doesn't violate the rights of others. So obviously murder violates the rights of others, as an example. But personal conduct is what I'm talking about. Personal moral behavior. And the last thing is this. I know there are many of you in here who feel a certain way about same-sex marriage. Okay? And we probably agree. But there's ways to fight the culture wars without using government coercion. All right? Pray for those people. Be active in your church. Be a testimony at your work or home or wherever you are. Because really, you're trying to win over their hearts with God's help. You're not trying to force them to behave a certain way. Because we all know, if you've had kids, that forcing them to do things is not going to work for very long. You'll get the external behavior you want, but you don't get to the heart. If you want the heart, you don't want to force them to behave in a certain way. So there's plenty we can do. This is not, and this is not saying that, again, you have to approve of gay marriage as an example. I've used several examples. I don't care if you approve of it or not. The fact is that we shouldn't be using government to force other people to behave the way we think they should. Again, so long as they don't violate the rights of others. Now, I have given you this. Let me finish my personal story. After going through all of this, I realized, okay, I can be a libertarian. I understand the role of government in this. Or do I? The rest of my story. Oh, one thing I forgot to tell you is that I ran for the state party chair of the Republican Party back in April. Didn't do real well, but I did pretty good for having a 5-day campaign. This is my daughter, Chris. So this political epiphany that I had happened in 2009, 2010. I'm gonna cry here soon. She came out in 2012. She's gay. I have a 20-year-old, an 18-year-old, and a 14-year-old. This is my 18-year-old Chris. And I gotta tell you, if she had come out 10 years ago, oh, it would have been bad. It would have been really bad. But having this understanding now, with her coming out, I have the opportunity to teach her about religious freedom and personal liberty. By the way, she's conservative. She's fiscally conservative. Okay, I guarantee you. Especially when she starts working, she's going to hate all the taxes coming out of her check, right? But see, now I have an opportunity to influence her and to guide her in the right direction and not believe all of the fiery rhetoric and all the falsehoods that she's getting from the other side, right? Here's my thing, though. I have a valid concern. She's 18. She gets to vote next year. What party is she going to vote for? It remains to be seen. So, this is personal for me. I think that if we truly embrace these principles of liberty, that's what's the key to religious freedom. Because that's what I want. I believe the principles of liberty are the only way to ensure that we have religious freedom, not trying to force other people to behave as Christians. Because they're going to use the law to force us to behave the way they want, and it's going to become an arms race. And we're seeing the negative results of that now. Now Christians are being forced to violate their conscience as well as the Constitution. And I think that, I had this great thing to wrap this up with, and I was distracted here. I truly believe in my heart that's the way to protect religious freedom. That's how I'm operating, right? And I understand different sides. Remember, I've been there. I was a fundamental Baptist. I understand how that thought process is. I honestly don't believe they're inconsistent. I think that you can be against gay marriage on a personal religious level, but still not use government to make other people do what you want them to do. So that's my presentation, and I want to thank everybody for your attention, and I want to thank you for your interest. This obviously when you start talking about your daughter, you get very vulnerable here, and